Good evening, everyone. Tonight's 10-minute tour is all about one of the most fascinating periods of British history, about the Stuart kings, as they became the kings over the water. The story of the Jacobite rebellions, 3 generations of Stuarts exiled to France, the claim they had to the throne of Great Britain, and the turmoil they caused across the entire British Isles. Welcome to tonight's tour, The Kings Across the Water. Our story begins not here, in the wild highlands of Scotland, as many people supposed. The Jacobite rebellion was many things, but it was not confined to one part of the British Isles. It does not begin either with Charles II. This is him receiving England's first ever pineapple. It began here, the London of the 1660s, Restoration London, the London recovering from the Great Fire and the Great Plague. And it was here that the king's brother, James, his younger brother, would take a fateful decision. He would convert to Catholicism. The talk at St James's Palace was of succession. Charles II had no legitimate children of his own. James did. He had 2 daughters, Mary and Anne, but Charles had made sure that they would be had been brought up as Protestants. Parliament was happy to allow the king his personal religious beliefs, but when he married a 15-year-old Italian princess, Mary of Modena, and then a boy was born. James Francis Edward Stuart, the Prince of Wales was his official title. History would know him as the Old Pretender. The thought of a Catholic succession, a Catholic dynasty, was too much for the English Parliament, and they invited Mary and her husband William from the Netherlands to come to England to take over the succession. It would be here in Ireland, specifically the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, that the great challenge would be met. William would be victorious in Ireland, James defeated and exiled to France to the great Chateau Saint-Germain-en-Laye, met by Louis XIV himself. Dismal Jimmy, as Nell Gwynn had nicknamed him, now had to watch as other favourites crowded around the new monarch. This is Elizabeth Villiers. Her nickname was Squinting Betty, the perhaps mistress of King William. After Mary died, William was king alone. After William died in 1702, Anne was queen alone. And after Anne died in 1714, they ran out of Protestants. The traditional bad luck of the Stuarts now came to the fore. The Act of Settlement offered the throne. It bypassed 42 Catholics with a better claim, including James Francis Stuart, to offer the throne to the son of the Electress of Hanover, Sophia. She passed it on almost immediately to her son George. The real question then was who would rally to the young James Francis Stuart, Prince of Wales. The French would not. At the treaty that ended the War of the Spanish Succession, they recognised the House of Hanover. James Francis Stuart was on his own. So who were these Stuarts who inspired such loyalty in Scotland? In the reign of David I, who'd been brought up at the court of Henry I, the son of William the Conqueror, many great French noble families were invited into Scotland. The Bruces, for example, came from Normandy originally, given the territory of Annandale to the south. The Fitzalans, who came from Brittany, were given lands in the area of modern Renfrewshire, and the first of these, Walter Fitzalan, was given the title Steward of Scotland. In time, this would be corrupted to Stuart, and it would be Mary Queen of Scots who would change the spelling to the modern spelling that we all know so well today. James arrived in Scotland in 1715 after the defeat at Sheriffmuir, and immediately the Scottish climate did for his health. He fell into a fever, with the French abandoning him, and the risings in Cornwall and Scotland soon put down. James fled back to France. From France, the kings across the water were expelled, making their way to Avignon and finally to Rome. Here they would set up a Stuart court in exile. James Francis Edward Stuart died in Rome on the 1st of January 1766 in his home on the Palazzo Muti, and was buried in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. His claimed reign had lasted for 64 years, 3 months and 16 days, longer than any British monarch until Queen Elizabeth II's reign surpassed it on the 23rd of May 2016. All eyes would now turn to his son, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie. Arriving in Scotland for the very first time in 1745, his standard was raised at Glenfinnan, and immediately the Highlanders began to rally to his cause. Soon Old Edinburgh was his, and the march south after the Battle of Prestonpans began. But the famous Stuart bad luck was still in evidence, and at Culloden the government forces would defeat all of the Highland clans. So would begin Charles's times of wandering, of hiding out in the Highlands in sea caves, waiting for the ship that would take him back to mainland Europe and to exile. Charles died in exile in Rome, 30th of January 1788, the 139th anniversary of the beheading of his great-grandfather, Charles I. That left one brother, Henry Benedict Stuart. He would die as a cardinal, but to the Stuart Jacobite loyalists he would be known as Henry IX. With the death of Henry, Jacobite genealogists now had to go all the way back to the sister of Charles II, the charming Minette as she were called. She had married the Duke of Orleans, and it was through this line that her daughter, Anne-Marie, had married into the House of Savoy. The accession now passed to the kings of Sardinia. In the Savoys, it would pass to the royal house of the Estes of Modena, and eventually to the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria. If this all seemed a long way from the Highlands of Scotland, that's because history, with its sense of irony, wasn't finished with the Stuarts yet. In 1921, this man, Ruprecht, Crown Prince of Bavaria, became head on the death of his father of the Wittelsbach family. He also became the leading Stuart claimant to the throne. The problem was, of course, he'd been a highly decorated, very successful military officer during the Great War. In fact, had led an entire army group Prince Ruprecht, on the Western Front. This is Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, brought up at Glamis Castle, where both Charles and James had been feted. If the Stuart claimant to the throne was a German, then the next Windsor Queen was going to be a Stuart. If it would take until the reign of Edward VII for finger bowls to be put back on royal tables, so that nobody could inadvertently give a toast to a king over the water, it would be our own Queen, Elizabeth II, who, with a little look back to her own mother, would give her 2 eldest children the impeccably Stuart names of Charles and Anne.